This is Monty once again from DPL Surveillance Equipment. How are you guys doing? I'd like to start off the podcast, as you may guess by now, with some small talk. We'd like to get a few things out of the way and clarified. Some are more important than others. One of the things that's important is that we always want to keep track of what's happening overall in the economy. Read your financial newspapers. For those of you who actually want to be successful, read your financial newspapers, whether it's online or offline. Take a look at your Wall Street journals. Listen to your Bloomberg radio financial reporting. And take a look at maybe, the London FTSE Times or whatever foreign or out of the country sources that you use. A lot of these really give you a very good idea. Allows you to have get a pulse on the economy, how things are going, so that when it's time to make business decisions, buy the house, buy the business, invest in this company or that company, you'll have a pretty good idea of why you're doing this at this time, at this price, in this manner. A lot of times it just makes more sense versus operating in a complete vacuum with an absence of information. It doesn't hurt to have an abundance of information, abundance of things that you've looked at in order to help shape the decision-making process when you're making major decisions and major purchases. So you may ask, who is this guy going on and on and on about the macro economy and decision making and all that? Well, just in case you don't know, my name is Monty Henry, owner of DPL Surveillance Equipment. We're a full-service surveillance and security equipment company. We have lifetime guarantees and warranties on all the products, 24/7, 365 tech sales and customer support. I think we have the largest inventory of items that not only can you buy and rent as well. And I know this for a fact because I've only been doing this for 20 years. And we have the largest directory of articles and podcasts and blogs and demonstration videos, just an abundance of educational information for those of you who like to educate yourselves. Go to the website, take a look at the articles, listen to the podcast, look at the videos, read the blogs and such. And you'll probably find out that the things that we're writing on and talking about and video recording, such as health and fitness, economics and finance, cryptocurrencies, counter surveillance and all these things, I think they're kind of interesting from my perspective because they touch on so many different areas that impact us on a daily basis, for instance. And if that weren't enough, we also accept cryptocurrencies in the way of Bitcoin and Ethereum and Litecoin. As I mentioned before, we were looking into this, and I paid a developer to integrate that into our shopping cart, and that's been finalized. And I did a test. I think I mentioned in one of the last podcasts, I would do a test, make sure it works properly. And lo and behold, my money did actually end up going to a test account where we verified that it works perfectly. So yeah, for those of you crypto millionaires and such who invested in Bitcoin and the other guys and made a good amount of money, don't hesitate to come to our business. We're one of the few businesses that actually allow you to use those cryptos and make purchases and get some of these spy gadgets and spy toys that we know you guys love to play with. Now, moving right along, we constantly talk about the idea that the MasterCards and the Visas and American Express companies aren't the way to go. They suck out $70 billion worth of financial resources, our hard-earned money. It's going out of the window and out the window into the hands of these vampires who have nothing better to do than use our own financial resources against us. So make sure you guys understand that this is not the way to go. That's not the way to go. You don't want to feed a system that's trying to bankrupt the entire country. Entrepreneurs and business owners like myself, we don't need to pay $70 billion a year annually to MasterCard and Visa and American Express just so they can tell us what we can sell, what we can't sell, under what terms and conditions we can sell it, and all of that. That doesn't make any sense. When you use Bitcoin, for instance, no one intercepts that transaction. When a transaction is made online, it's going directly from my pocket to yours or vice versa. We don't need, and we don't have to have, nor do we desire, to have anyone intercept that transaction and block it and say, you know what, let me look at it. Let me see if you qualify to buy this. Let me see if you qualify to sell that. Let me see if your country is on this or that list and all of that. So this is a way to liberate ourselves from the financial oppression that far too many people have gotten used to over the years. So let's step away from that system and let's embrace the new system quickly as possible. I think the millennials get it. We just need to make sure the baby boomers and the older generations get it, because who needs it, right? While walking to a branch bank, the branch of a bank, and have some idiot waste a lot of time sitting behind a desk with a suit and tie on, telling you what you can do, what you can't do, when you can just use an app to quickly get that money moved from point A to point B while you're sitting there drinking your coffee on the beach or something. So certain things make sense, and certain other things just don't make any sense at all. Okay? So anyway, as we make this transition, let's keep these things in mind, that this is here and this is now, and we don't have to wait any longer. Let's just start using it. Just do it. And so moving right along. Now, today's topic is all about debt. We've been talking about corporate debt. We've been talking about personal debt. We've been talking about government debt. We haven't highlighted corporate debt as much as we've been talking about government and personal debt. Personal debt, the last podcast we talked about, it was topping out at around $13.3 trillion. Government debt, we talked about that topping out at approximately $22 trillion. So now let's take a look at corporate debt. Corporate debt. Before we get into that, let me see. The name of this article. What is this name of this article, by the way? The name of the article is U.S. Companies Sit on a Mountain of Debt. Total debt for U.S. corporations tops $6 trillion. Now, the reason why this is important is because right before the last financial crisis, that is the type of number that we saw when corporate debt was approaching those levels during the last 2008-9 financial crisis. That was roughly where we were with corporate debt. So typically, you don't want to repeat the past. When you make mistakes, excuse me, the noise, I'm cleaning my car. Typically, when you make mistakes and things come crashing down around your ears, you want to find out. You want to understand what you did wrong, right? One of the things we did wrong was people were over-leveraged. Corporations, the government, and personal debt were at all-time highs. We already highlighted that personal debt is at an all-time high. Government debt is higher than it's ever been. And corporate debt seems to be nearing those levels where it was before. So let's take a look at some of the specifics. The riskiest borrowers are more leveraged than they were even during the financial crisis, according to S&P analysis, which looked at 2017 year-end balance sheets for non-financial corporations. On first glance, total debt has risen roughly $2.3 trillion over the past 5 years, with cash as a percentage of debt hovering around 33% for U.S. companies, flat compared to 2016, but removing the top 25 cash holders from the equation points a grimmer picture. Now, basically, they're saying that most of the largest companies, the Googles and the Apples and the Facebooks, basically the FANG stocks, a number of these companies have a significant amount of cash on their balance sheets, and they don't have the type of leverage that's causing as much concern. In other words, when you have a cash hoard like Apple of 200 billion or something, your ability to weather the storm is going to be greatly different as compared to someone like, who knows, what company. Can't think of any right off the top, but we're going to talk about a few companies that have way too much debt as compared to what they should have. Okay, so speculative grade borrowers, for example, reached a new record low cash to debt ratio of just over 12% in 2017, below the 14. Where was I? Below the 14% reported in 2008 during the crisis. These borrowers have $8 of debt for every $1 of cash, wrote Andrew Chang, primary credit analyst at S&P Global. We note these borrowers borrow significant amounts under extremely favorable terms in a benign credit market to finance their buyouts at an ever-increasing purchase multiple without effectively improving their liquidity profiles. So basically, you had a lot of companies who took on that debt, borrowed that cheap money, and didn't necessarily shore up their balance sheets, which is something we're going to get into, but this is basically what happened. A lot of borrowing of tons of money. Balance sheets were not even shored up with all of that extra money. The trend persists even among highly rated borrowers. More than 450 investment-grade companies, not among the top 1% of cash-rich issuers, have cash-to-debt ratios more similar to those of speculative issuers, hovering around 21%. So we have a lot of companies who are basically have debt ratios that are equivalent to speculative issuers out of like 450 companies. So this indicates that there's a lot of companies out there who really don't have the type of balance sheets where they should be rated investment grade, when in actuality Standard & Poor's and Moody's is indeed rating them as if they were okay investments as compared to junk rated companies. And this is not helping us, but we'll cover that eventually as well. Okay. This could lead to trouble for the economy as interest rates rise. The Federal Reserve, which has already hiked rates twice so far this year, has indicated that further increases may be needed to keep the economy in check later in 2018. It has also actively reduced the amount of purchases it is making in the Treasury and mortgage markets. Now, this is the catalyst that we think could ignite or cause the dominoes to start falling. When interest rates start going up, a lot of that debt has to be priced accordingly, right? According to the new interest rate. If the interest rate goes 2 to 3, 4 to 5, 5 to 6, or whatever it is going to be, that means a lot of this debt is going to be more expensive, more difficult to manage, especially in an environment where you don't necessarily have increased demand or consumer demand or whatever for your products and services. So this is a problem that we think is going to be a tipping point for a lot of these companies who have way too much leverage. Okay? So, let's see. Where are we? Okay, we only have, we have $8 of debt for every $1 of cash. This is not very good. We want to just make sure you guys understand when you have $1 of cash to your $8 of debt, every $8 of debt, that ratio indicates that you're vulnerable. Okay, it's good again, as I mentioned, when the economy is booming and your products and services are selling or whatever. A lot of times companies look good, people look good, everyone's a genius when times are good. But when things slow down and you have that type of leverage or $8 of debt to $1 of cash, you're going to have trouble paying off that debt because you don't have the cash, as the ratios indicate. So that is a problem waiting to happen. And we don't want to ignore that, definitely. Let's see. Many investors remain concerned about corporate leverage, which still matches the highest levels. Again, as we said, the highest levels hit during the financial crisis. U.S. companies have been scaling back borrowing while posting improved earnings, making their first sustained stretch of deleveraging since shortly after the financial crisis, and stoking cautious optimism that could reduce the threat from their still elevated debt levels. So there's some exceptions out there, definitely, where some companies are deleveraging and they're getting those ratios more in line according to what they should be rated at by Standard & Poor's and Moody's, for instance, as compared to companies who double their leverage and they still get an investment grade rating, or the rating doesn't change very much at all, even taking on twice as much debt. So that's kind of a red flag that lets you know that there's some hanky-panky going on within the credit rating agencies, kind of similar to what happened in the financial meltdown in real estate that we saw, where packaging of loans was such that junk subprime loans were grouped together with just a few prime loans as a percentage ratio. And when you have more junk or subprime loans in a package that's sold to investors as if it were a high quality, a high grade type of package on average, then you're misleading people and you're putting investors at risk. Okay, you can't have this type of deception going on, whether it's companies rated by Moody's or S&P. If it's junk, it's junk. If it's investment grade, then it's investment grade, and it needs to be rated that way accordingly. Otherwise, someone needs to be sued for misleading the public. And that's basically where we're going with that. Okay. The U.S. corporate sector started to cut its aggregate pace of borrowing by some measures after commodity prices plunged a few years ago, dealing a blow to energy companies and the debt investors who had funded them. Now, higher interest rates and changes in the tax code have created a further drag on bond issuance, just as a pickup in economic growth has lifted corporate earnings. The level of debt, corporate earnings. The level of debt in the corporate sector has been widely viewed as a major risk to the U.S. economy after a period of aggressive monetary stimulus and ultra-low interest rates helped to fuel a borrowing boom in recent years. Okay, while debt can help companies when the economy is doing well, as I mentioned, it can magnify problems when conditions sour, making even modest deleveraging a welcome development to investors. The year-to-year growth of earnings before interest, taxes, and depreciation and amortization, a measure of cash flow known as EBITDA, generated by U.S. corporations, has now roughly matched or exceeded debt growth for 6 straight years, according to Bank of America Merrill Lynch data, following 21 quarters in which the opposite was true. So again, it looks like there's some progress, not enough. definitely, as far as EBITDA and the deleveraging is concerned. As a result, U.S. corporate debt amounted to 3.4 times EBITDA on June 30th. That is down from a recent peak of 3.5 times in early 2016. In the previous 5 years, leverage rose steadily from a post-crisis low of 2.6 times, using that measure of debt as a multiple of cash flow. So yeah, again, using EBITDA as a way of measuring the financial stability of these companies, we can clearly see that those numbers were indeed improving, going to 3.4 times as compared to 3.5 times in early 2016. So there's some good news, but definitely not enough. Earnings are growing, and companies are not borrowing as much, so the process of delevering is underway, said Oleg Milentev, a credit strategist at Bank of America Merrill Lynch. Mining giant Freeport-McMoRan is one company that has reduced leverage in recent years. In 2015, Freeport was a prime example of a natural resources company that had borrowed too much after the financial crisis, having increased its debt by nearly 6 times to more than $20 billion as it expanded in the oil and gas business. The steep drop in oil prices, however, forced Freeport to shift strategy. For the past 5 years. The Phoenix company, Phoenix, Arizona, has been selling assets and paying down bonds, bringing its total debt to $11.1 billion as of June 30th. Meanwhile, its adjusted EBITDA nearly doubled in the second quarter from a year earlier, resulting in a leverage of 1.4 times cash flow, down from 2.9 times in the year earlier period, according to research firm Credit Sites. So again, this is an example of one company in the oil and gas sector that made some bad choices, made some bad investments, used the wrong strategy. It started to work against it, but Freeport decided to fix the problem, address it, and get its balance sheet in order. So let this be a lesson to you guys on with your personal finances. When you make a mistake and you borrow a lot of money that you really, I wouldn't say really don't need, but if you're going to use borrowed money, make sure you understand that it's very costly to borrow money and not do the right thing with it. The last thing you want to do with borrowed money is make the mistake of forgetting to pay down your debt, pay off the credit cards, and do those types of things. And nothing more stupid than having more credit that you owe and not use it properly. You cannot start to build up your investment. You cannot start to build up your savings unless you get that credit, unless you get the credit cards paid off and get that debt paid off. Okay, it just doesn't make any sense. I'm just going to lost my place. See if I can find out where I was. Okay, Freeport-McMoRan. Examples of deleveraging, again, examples of deleveraging outside the energy sector are typically not as dramatic. One factor is the sharp decline in bond issuance by investment-grade technology companies, which generally have slowed their borrowing to finance large share buyback programs after the tax overhaul changed the treatment of overseas cash holdings. And just to put this in proper perspective, when the tax law was revised so that a lot of these companies can bring monies back and save money on their taxes, instead of improving their balance sheets, these idiots, for the most part, started to increase their stock buyback programs, and dividend payouts increased. So, in other words, investors and these companies, the people who run them, are so stupid that they think it's a better idea to not instead of concentrating on the long-term viabilities of the companies, they're just rewarding investors, giving their investors a temporary shot in the arm, like a fix of caffeine or something, where you basically increase that dividend buy back those shares, and yeah, on a temporary basis, the earnings will go up, stocks will go up, but you're not considering the fact that over the long term, you're supposed to make investments in capital. You're supposed to make investments in R&D. You're supposed to hire talent, the type of people who are going to run that company and make sure that over the next 10 years, 20 years, 30 years or something, that you have a very viable, competitive entity. So anyway, moving right along. Let's see here, what else we're talking about here. Like we talked about Freeport, we talked about deleveraging and bond issuance. Through August 23rd, total bond issuance this year by investment-grade tech companies was $21 billion, down from nearly $114 billion through the same period last year, according to Dealogic. Apple Incorporated, Oracle Corp, for instance, haven't issued any bonds in 2018 after selling a combined $45 billion in bonds last year. So it looked like the top companies, the top-tier companies, they know that you don't issue bonds indefinitely, taking advantage of this cheap money, and without considering that, there's obviously a point at which you got to pull back. At some point, you got to start selling your company's products, and what they call focusing on the top line, focusing on sales, as compared to financial gimmickry that you can do with the with issuing bonds, for instance, just because you have a low interest rate environment. Debt investors generally aren't interested in this sort of deleveraging because it doesn't affect net debt or total debt minus their cash holdings. It also suggests companies are still making it a priority to return cash to shareholders rather than improve their balance sheets. So, as far as I can tell, this paragraph indicates that debt investors are so stupid that they don't realize that, look, you can't have one group of investors pitted against the other group. The goals or the objectives should be the same for the same company, okay? Whether I'm a debt investor or whether or not I'm a equity investor, I want the long-term viability of my company to be such that we have a formidable company that we're investing in that's going to dominate its industry and make as much money possible over the long term, okay? So I'm not quite sure why debt investors want to focus more on why they wouldn't be as much concerned about deleveraging. Returning cash to shareholders, increasing dividend payouts. I don't care if you're a bondholder or not. Those things are temporary in nature. The balance sheet needs to be shored up, needs to be strong, needs to have as little debt as possible, as much cash flow as possible. That way, if you do want to go out and make acquisitions, if you do want to pay a lot of money for talent, if you do want to put a lot of money into research and development, it won't be a problem, okay? So I'm not quite sure why this particular paragraph makes it seem like debt investors should have different priorities as compared to equity investors. To me, that's stupid, as far as I can tell. Many investors remain concerned about corporate leverage. According to the most recent Federal Reserve data, total U.S. corporate debt stood at 45.2% of gross domestic product at the end of the first quarter. That is down a tick from 45.3% 6 months earlier, but still matches the highest level it reached during the financial crisis. So, again, we have some metrics that indicate we are bumping up against the same type of numbers, the same type of scenario where we were during the last financial crisis. Okay? The corporate sector in the United States is highly levered relative to where it's been, said Kristen Strack, global head of credit research at Pacific Investment Management Company. Even if it doesn't directly lead to a recession, this elevated debt burden could eventually cause a lot of potential stress and a lot of potential problems if the economy gets worse, he said. Now, I have to make sure you guys understand, look, just because in and of itself or by itself, if corporate debt doesn't actually tip us into a recession, what definitely will is, for instance, when interest rates start going up and you combine corporate debt with personal debt, the $13.3 trillion of personal debt, the $22 trillion of government debt, plus the $6 trillion worth of corporate debt, that will be a problem because when you have to make higher interest payments, for instance, on your government debt, and you're basically not even touching your principal, you're going to have a problem. So yeah, when you combine all of these together, that's where you really start to see that there's a problem. Things isolated, you may maybe have a tendency to overlook it as far as the impact, but definitely you got to look at the fact that we've got three different major sectors where we have a lot of debt. The corporate, again, of $6 trillion, the government of $22 trillion, and the personal of $13.3 trillion, okay? High interest rates on that debt, when you combine it, it's going to be a problem for somebody, okay? Let's keep moving right along. Some companies, meanwhile, are still ramping up their leverage. In recent years, credit rating firms have often allowed companies to maintain their investment grade ratings even as they have added significant amounts of debt to finance acquisitions. While interest rates have ticked higher, that trend has continued this year, for instance, with Dr. Pepper Snapple more than doubling its leverage as it merged with Keurig Green Mountain. The new Keurig, Dr. Pepper Incorporated, is rated investment grade Baa2 by Moody's Investors Service, one notch below Dr. Pepper's old Baa1 rating and three notches above Keurig's old junk bond rating. Now, again, this is an example of when you double your leverage, just like you guys going out, you owe $50,000, you go out you go out and you borrow $50,000 more on top of that original $50,000, so that you have $100,000 in debt. At some point, your FICO score or something should reflect that you've gone overboard, okay, or that you have a lot more debt. But what they're saying here is Moody's has decided to keep the same investment grade rating as if the leverage to cash ratios or something were identical to what they were before Dr. Pepper took on this additional debt. So someone's lying, someone's not being honest, and some people definitely will get burned eventually. And if I were you guys, I would learn how to read annual reports, learn how to read balance sheets, and double check what you're investing in, because it doesn't look like the rating agencies are doing you any favors in terms of letting you know really what you're investing in. Okay, somebody's going to get screwed and they're going to get hurt. Where were we? Let's see. For nearly a decade, companies have taken advantage of extremely cheap money set by the Fed and foreign central banks trying to pump up sluggish growth. Excluding the highly leveraged financial sector, corporate debt relative to GDP matched an all-time high during the third quarter of 2017, according to an analysis of the most recent numbers by Informa Financial Intelligence. It's certainly a reason to be cautious, particularly when we are long into this growth cycle and the Fed is raising rates, said David Ader, chief macro strategist at Informa Financial Intelligence. Everything is fine and well until it isn't, he said. Okay, so that's the conclusion of that. And just want to reiterate, corporate debt, just like financial debt, you want to be responsible. You want to learn how to manage it. You want to know how important it is to use money wisely. When you borrow money, I don't care if it's a corporate level or not, but particularly on the corporate level, You want to make sure you shore up your balance sheet, invest in hopefully capital, equipment, research and development, market growth, certain things like that. I'm not a big fan of just increasing stock buybacks and dividends for shareholders. I think on a personal level, you better understand exactly what you're getting into when you start borrowing that money, because you can't write it off. It's not tax deductible, and you will get burned eventually if you're just getting home improvements, a new kitchen, a new patio or gazebo, Rolex watches, or big screen TVs. These things aren't going to help you. You need to pay down that debt, pay off those credit cards, and start accumulating cash as much as possible. And check out Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies, by the way. As I like to say at the conclusion of every podcast, you guys be safe out there and keep your eyes and ears open. Have a good day. Thank you. Take care and bye.